So thanks for taking the time to be a part of this webinar. This is a really important topic, and it's something that we get asked about all the time, given how many priorities sit on a content team. And depending on the complexity of a company, it's a pretty big challenge to navigate. So we wanted to put something together on this. And the way we think about this, and there are a ton of resources out there in terms of building out a good SEO roadmap, for example, and those can be quite tactical, where it's specifics like keyword research and prioritizing based on, let's say, keyword difficulty or volume available out there or competition. But where we'd like to focus and where this webinar will be focused is on the strategic side and the preliminary layers that help us figure out where should content as a function focus its attention, its resources, and its overall strategy. And so that's what this webinar in particular is about. And as you think about your particular instance, a lot of these frameworks and models that will be shared in this should apply across the board. So you can bring that back to your particular business and think about what's the best way to think about the content roadmap and strategy for your use case. So with that said, I think the starting point where we have to begin is to think about the fact that content plays a role across every stage of the customer lifecycle, right? So it's responsible for driving awareness for the business. If leads or prospects are at the top of the funnel, it's about getting them activated or into a demo. From there, we have to get that person or account to adopt our solution. And then from there, we have to retain them and turn them into hopefully loyal customers and even advocates for us to build a business going forward. And so as we think about all the different roles content has, I would say there are 10 critical roles that anyone in a content function usually has to fulfill. And the struggle here is that we kind of have to juggle responsibilities across all these different domains. So number one is you have discovery. This is helping prospects find you via awareness channels and campaigns. This could be SEO, it could be paid social, it could be speaking. Whatever that is, it's about driving awareness to whatever it is that you have to offer. Number two is nurture. This is talking to prospects and getting them from wherever they are in their journey today and getting them through to the next stage. And nurturing can happen via email. It can happen via other channels like paid social. If you're retargeting someone that's, let's say, shared their email address with you, it can happen through sales, right? Whatever those different channels are, we want to make sure we have enough assets to nurture those prospects through to the next stage. Third is enablement. This is where we're supporting the sales team to convert more the deals that are in our pipeline through to close one status. And they often need a lot of support in order to get there. That could be the decks that they need, the one-pagers, the case studies, and all the different things in between that help them have better sales conversations and not just to follow up to say, hey, are you ready to buy now? Or 2 weeks later, again, sending a similar email. Fourth is onboarding. Now that we've closed the customer and they're ready to get our product adopted into their organization, well, we need to help them get the most out of the platform so that they stay with us long term and don't, let's say, churn in 90 days or a year's time. And so this is where we might work with customer success, we might work with product and a PLG model, and really getting the customers to understand what are all the different value points inside the product and how do they get the most out of that functionality. Fifth is retention, and this is where we want to increase usage and the value the customers receive from the product on an ongoing basis. So if, for example, we're selling a software that helps them generate more revenue for their organization, is their revenue climbing up over time? Are the number of transactions going up over time? Do they see more customers coming through the platform for themselves over time? And so we want to educate them to leverage all the functionality of the product to get to a point where their organization is almost dependent on the product to succeed, and they're better for it because they're producing more value for the organization. Sixth is advocacy, and this is where we are looking at how do we increase the loyalty and word of mouth for the solution. And this is where we might turn customers into advocates for ourselves. We might focus on building campaigns that target our top verticals or funnel back the insights that we've learned from our best customers into what we do with our demand gen campaigns or our awareness campaigns. It might be what we have in our product roadmap and what we put out front and on the website in the form of product marketing. Then we have authority content, and this is quite different from the rest, where up until now we're talking about what's required for the funnel, and at every stage of the life cycle, how do we get the customer or prospect to get the most value so that they move on to the next stage. With authority, it's about building a better presence in the marketplace so that you have more gravity in the market and you win more of those commoditized battles, right? So if you're selling sales enablement software and there are 10 players out there, well, they kind of need to differentiate themselves beyond features. So how do you tell a better story that resonates with that market and get them into your funnel? Next is brand, and brand is connected to that authority piece, where authority might be the thought leadership content, and brand is about what is your positioning and messaging and strategic narrative and how that connects to the rest of the marketplace and how you kind of differentiate yourselves against competitors and other solutions that are out there. And then the last piece is comms work, and this is more admin tasks associated with the marketing organization, but it really just does fall on the shoulders of content. Is we might have critical corporate news, like let's say we've acquired a company that needs to be communicated to our customers or the market. There might be some type of a press release or a PR-oriented campaign that we need to work on. But in all of these cases, this is another bucket of content, and somebody on the marketing team needs to create it. When we think about the order in which content should be created, we look at this very simple framework. And if you're a startup or a single product company, this framework is probably good enough to build a version 1 of your product roadmap, of your content roadmap, excuse me. And so you want to start with what are the core product marketing assets that you need to be able to convert customers. This could be basic website content. It could be some of the basic resources that you have via email or for sales, whatever they're empowered with. And that connects directly to the sales enablement content as well, because those are the decks that they have, the conversations that they're having through their email cadences, what are the call scripts that they potentially have. From there, you move to customer marketing, because usually your warmest lead will be an existing customer. And so starting there for demand gen is usually a good idea, especially if there are upsell and cross-sell opportunities. As you resolve those, you work your way towards nurture content. And these are prospects that are further down the funnel and they need some additional attention or education to get to the next stage. And then you look at things like thought leadership and SEO that are focusing on driving prospects to the top of the funnel. I think if you were to just take this slide and turn it into the top 10 to 20 assets that your organization needs to produce, you would probably come up with a different list of priorities than, let's say, if you were just to build an SEO roadmap out, right? So maybe there are a ton of searches for a specific keyword or a set of search terms that are related to your business, but likely that doesn't need to be at the top of your list if a lot of these other items are not filled out. But the challenge that we come up on is that even though we know this, content teams are pulled in different directions. And so we don't have enough resources to meet the expectations that we have. And there's a ton of other forces at play that are distracting the content team. So we have cross-department demands that drive our own roadmap. There might be an item that comes from, let's say, an M&A transaction that we now need to draft resources or emails to customers around. There might be urgent deadlines. Maybe there's a new feature release that is now entered our roadmap where we need a blog post explaining how that feature release will help customers do better. Or maybe there's a pricing increase and we need to communicate that to customers. Then there are additionally demand gen targets or campaigns that we need to support. Like, let's say the paid media team is launching paid social campaigns and they need certain assets to run those campaigns. Maybe it's a landing page, maybe it's a white paper or downloadable, maybe it's a webinar. So we need to build those. And then we run into this problem where, because there aren't enough team members or budget, we kind of don't have enough time to work on all of these things. And so what ends up happening is content teams, instead of focusing on these right 3 items, which is where a ton of value can be created, ultimately revenue growth is going to come from the fact that, are we supporting enough demand gen programs, and are there enough content resources in place to convert people into becoming customers or driving more revenue from them? And if we don't have the resources for that, that's not going to happen. Or if we don't have enough budget, that's not going to happen. And so what ends up happening instead is we're focusing on these 2 items. So some examples would be if there's a new product launch or an upcoming event, it's all hands on deck on content, and that's what we're working on instead of all these other items. And so the result ends up becoming is that content is a support function. It's often viewed as a cost center more than a revenue generator. And the content team is primarily reactive. And this is what we want to avoid at all costs, where there's no clear strategy, there's no framework for prioritization, and there's no mechanism for scaling impact. I see Mike is asking if he can have these slides. Yes, you can. We will definitely share it after the fact. And so what we want is we want the opposite of this. We want a content team that is proactive, has a clear strategy. There is a ruthless form of prioritization. And I would say this is one of the biggest mistakes made by content teams is there's no framework in place to say no. So if sales needs another one pager, should that actually be our priority, or is there something else more important that we can now say no to these people as well? And then the last part is that if we have no mechanism for scaling impact or no way of measuring how we are doing, then getting additional budget that helps us scale our impact becomes difficult. And so we need this in order to have more content marketers on the team so that we can produce more assets and actually make a bigger impact on the overall growth of the organization. And so how do we fix this? Number one is we need to prioritize the efforts on content by tying priorities to the overall company strategy. This is actually my LinkedIn post from today, if you've seen the drawing. But the idea is that our functional strategy for content should be informed by our overall department strategy for marketing, which should be defined by the overall company strategy. It should not be the other way around. And a lot of content teams get stuck in this siloed trap of starting with their functional strategy. So for example, if I'm a content marketer and I see opportunity in SEO, I could be doing a great job in SEO and I may have even increased top of funnel traffic by, let's say, 5,000 or 10,000 visitors over a 12-month span. But if in that time, the number one company strategy is actually cross-sell, upsell, and that's where the biggest levers are, this function has actually failed its job. And so what we want to do is we actually want to understand what are the top level items at the company level and work our way down to the content strategy instead of the other way around. Even if there are some good opportunities available, we are going to have to say no to those things so that we are all aligned with the overall business and not siloed as a function. That also increases our odds of getting more budget long term, because if, let's say, we were to start with the SEO strategy where cross-sell, upsell was a priority, and we end up at a board meeting at the end of the year, it'll turn out that we've missed our targets on cross-sell, upsell, which were probably significant, but we've done well with SEO. But because SEO was not as core to what we needed to do, it's now hard to lobby for additional budget to say we need more money for content because we made so much of an impact, because actually we didn't do what we were supposed to do. And so the method for prioritization is to look at it through 5 steps. Number one is starting with the strategic priorities for the business and understanding what are those levers and what is being discussed at the management meetings or at the board level. Number 2 is looking at the revenue opportunity inside those levers. And number 3 is connecting that to the financial targets that we have for the business. 4 is the funnel efficiency that we have and where are the biggest opportunities areas there. And then 5 is the overall buyer journey gaps. All of these items are inputs that help us figure out what is the right content roadmap for our particular function. So let's start with number 1 here. So strategic priorities. So let's look at company A on the left. The goal of company A on the left, it might be that the biggest strategic levers identified in this business are, number 1, increase your website traffic, 2, increase trial to paid conversions, and 3, maybe they launched a new payment processor and they need to increase customer adoption of that payment processor. On the flip side, you have company B, where the number 1 priorities that have been identified is to cross-sell to the existing customer base. You want to target your dream 100 customers, and there are pricing increases coming that need to be communicated to existing customers and even new customers, and there's a ton of content work that needs to be done around that. We can easily see that the content roadmap for company A would look very different than the content roadmap for company B. It could be that they're different business models. It could be that they're a different stage in their journey. It could just be that the opportunities against each of these items is just quite different. And so depending on what these items are for each business, we're going to need different people on the content team. For example, if we're targeting Dream 100 customers, we likely need marketers that are well-versed in ABM, versus if we're trying to increase website traffic, we likely need marketers who are more focused on SEO or paid search, as an example. Next, we want to map the revenue opportunity that's available to us. So let's take some of the items on the last slide and try to build out a basic data model just to understand how we evaluate these opportunities. So let's say we're talking about payments platform. We might say, hey, we need $200,000 to capture the value that's available here. The revenue opportunity here is about $1.5 million if we have adoption from our existing base of customers. So there's about a 7.5x ROI if we put in this 200K. And then in terms of recovering this, it might take us 18 months, but our likelihood of success is quite high and the risk level is low because these are existing customers, they're already using our product, and there's not a whole lot we need to do to get them over into our payments solution. Conversely, we might have this idea that we need to launch our own partner program as a way to increase adoption or help customers get onboarded and onto the solution. Here, the investment might be, let's say, $100,000, but there's minimal revenue opportunity. Let's say there's only $200,000 available, and the ROI is 2x, which is still not bad, but to get a partner program up and running might take us 2 years. And there's so many complexities to that and so many distractions that the likelihood of us seeing that through is quite low too. So while the risk level is low, we're only having to put in about 200,000. Our likelihood of success is also low, and so we likely don't want to focus on this app opportunity, at least to start on the content side. Number 3, if you look at the Dream 100 accounts, it might be that there's a $10 million revenue opportunity here because these deal sizes are huge. Maybe they're all over 100,000 in average deal size. But in order to capture this, we need to produce a ton of one-to-one content to target those accounts and the contacts within those accounts. So we likely need a lot more investment, and that's about $1 million, let's say, between headcount and programs. But the ROI, if you look at that, is 10x and higher than even the payments platform that we were taking a look at. And the time to ROI might be 18 to 24 months. I think 18 months is maybe generous here. But the likelihood of success is quite high because if we know these are our ideal fit customers, they are worth over 100K to us, the likelihood is high if we execute this properly. But the risk level is also pretty decently sized when we look at the $1 million investment that's required. And then the last one would be, let's say, cross-sell and upsell. Well, we have to put in 500,000. Let's say there's an additional 2.5 million in opportunity because we've segmented our customers, and we say out of the 100% of customers of this product, we see 30% that are a good fit for this other product, and that maybe totals to 2.5 million in opportunity. By putting 500,000 in, we can generate the 2.5, and that gives us about a 5x ROI. And with a motivated sales team, we could probably capture that in about 12 months' time. And so this is a pretty good opportunity for us too, because the likelihood of success is quite high and the risk level is quite low. And so regardless of what business you're in, whether you're company A here or company B, you kind of want to have this kind of a model built out often at the department level, at the marketing team level, and that should flow down to the content team level to say, okay, if we are launching our payments platform, what are the assets that we need? Because this seems to be pretty high priority. Similarly, you want all other items listed too, right? You might have other product marketing campaigns here, other sales enablement assets, other SEO assets that need to be listed as well. And you want to compare that to these big levers that are available to the business, and then make a decision on which area do you want to prioritize first, given that we have limited resources. It's quite unlikely that we're going to get funding for all of it, right? So where do we want to focus our resources? Number 3, you want to look at your financial targets. And this is where we're now talking about net new customers. Net new customers in general are usually one of the top items that most companies are looking at. So this is why it's super important, but you would likely have financial targets for any significant initiative. So for example, if you're talking about cross-sell, upsell, that is in your revenue targets. If there's a pricing increase, that's likely in your financial targets as well. Payments processor, whatever you name it, it's likely in there. So what we want to do is we want to look at the budget and the bookings targets and figure out what do we need to support reaching those targets from a marketing perspective, and then figure out what does content need to do to help marketing get there. So for example, in 2022, we need about 17,000 MQLs to hit our goal of closing almost 10 million in bookings. Well, of that 17,000, what does content need to drive? And which areas of content are those MQLs going to come from in order to be able to help us hit those bookings targets, and kind of work our way backwards from that to say, if we definitely need to do those activities to contribute to pipeline enough so that we get to that number, then what are the things that we definitely have to do, and what are the things we're going to ruthlessly cut from our prioritization? Number 4, we want to look at the funnel inefficiency across the board in our business. And this is a simplistic approach, but let's assume this is our funnel for one product line in particular. And let's say we've spent $70,000, there's about 120 MQLs. From that, we have about 13 deals in the pipeline, and we close about 4 of them. So 12 MQLs to 13 opportunities, that's about an 11% conversion rate. and then $5,400 per MQL for the 13 opportunities. And then we close 4 deals from those 13 opportunities. So that's about a 31% close rate, average deal size of 12,000. Based on these numbers, our CAC to acquire each of these 4 accounts is about, our customer acquisition cost is 17,500 when we make about 12,000 from that account. So our payback period is about 17 and a half or 18 months to get our capital recovered, which is not bad. But immediately we can see some issues here. Well, 18 months is not ideal. We want this number to likely be below 12. And then we can kind of go back through the funnel and see where are the issues or where are the conversion rates really plummeting. And so in this case, 30% close rates on opportunities is pretty decent. And I think we can maybe improve that. Some world-class companies are above 40% even, but 30 to 40% is usually quite healthy. But if we look at this MQL to opportunity rate, it's only 11%. And so immediately content doing this data analysis work, and you can actually get way more complicated with this, right? Because you can look at these conversion rates, not just overall, you can look at it by channel, by campaign, by program, or by geography, by product line, and you can start doing these splits across the board. And if you were to have a massive spreadsheet, let's say you have 4 product lines, it might turn out that the MQL to opportunity rate is problematic in 2 of them, whereas the opportunity to close rate is problematic in the other 2, right? And that now creates a different set of prioritization if, let's say, it was the other way around. And then what you want to do is the area that's the most problematic, you now want to figure out what content assets or what content can do to pump up those conversion rates. And so this is where we get to step 5, where you're doing the buyer journey gap analysis and looking through awareness, knowledge, consideration, adoption, expansion, retention, advocacy across the board and saying, where do we have a ton of assets? So in this case, it might be that we have a good amount of sales enablement assets, which is why we're able to close deals and our sales team is effective. And overall, they're in a good enough state. Whereas it may turn out from an MQL to opportunity state, we don't have enough content or nurture streams or webinars or paid social campaigns or account-based targeting or segmentation, you name it. We likely don't have enough there to be able to get customers through to close one or at least opportunity status so that 30% can play a bigger role, right? So even if we can get this number from 13 out of 120 to 20 out of 120, it will pay so many dividends down the funnel. And so when we get to this buyer journey gap analysis and look at all those assets, we want to figure out where are we lighter and where are we heavier and where is it a critical enough gap that it's affecting our conversion rates. And then we want to prioritize that particular journey stage over all others, even if there are a ton of good ideas around other journey stages. So it might turn out that, for example, you have 5 to 10 other sales enablement assets that sales reps have requested from you, but you don't have enough nurture streams. So you kind of have to deprioritize those assets requested by sales because you have data as a form of saying no. And this is the thing that's likely missing in a lot of content organizations is the ability to say no with reason. And because of that, we end up being more reactive. And so as we go through this process and we look at all these different inputs, eventually what you want to do is you want to take your strategic priorities, your revenue opportunity, your financial targets, your funnel inefficiency, and the buyer journey gaps to ultimately create a consolidated roadmap. And what this roadmap needs to look like is to have all the assets that should be of the highest priority and produced in the near term as the focus. And there would be filters set up on that where you have, let's say, 5 sales enablement assets, 2 nurture streams, maybe a couple of SEO pieces of content as well that are prioritized there, and then maybe some corporate marketing materials. And then the rest is maybe priority 2, 3, 4, or is focused for a later quarter because you just don't have enough bandwidth for that. And so that and you can get way more complicated with this as you layer on additional product lines or geographies or even languages, let's say, when you're trying to figure out where the prioritization should be. As you have that roadmap in place, this is where you want to go to ask for more budget. And again, keeping things simple here so that we can spend more time in the Q&A. But coming back to some of the levers that we identified, we might say, hey, to launch this payment processor, we need about $200,000. And some of this might be sales resources, some of it might be marketing resources. But the content budget ask could be, we need $80,000 for one product marketer. For the partner program, it's just not something that we're going to work on right now because we have other things to work on. So we're going to have no budget ask for that. For the Dream 100 accounts, we need $500,000, and that includes capital for 2 ABM marketers and maybe even some paid media spend. And then for the cross-sell, upsell avenues, we need $80,000 and potentially 1 customer marketer to help us create those campaigns and target existing customers. And so you can see that immediately we're able to ask for over $600,000 for content to scale in an environment where oftentimes content usually has 1 or 2 people on the team. Or if you're multiple product lines, maybe there's 1 person per product line really focused on content. And by tying the work to the investment committee planning and the budget forecasting and the revenue opportunity, we're now able to ask for significantly more budget and tie our work to revenue. So now we're also revenue accountable, but we can ask for resourcing as if we are as well. And immediately you can see how this content team would grow by 4 people, where previously maybe they only had 2 content marketers. And it's quite unrealistic to ask a marketing team or content team of 2 people to do all 4 of these things. Likely they could only maybe do 1 at best, and everything else that's more maintenance mode work would not be able to get done. And so if we were to blow this out on different in different companies based on their scenarios, you would have a much more fully built out plan. But at a high level, this is kind of what it needs to look like as you're running through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, starting with those priorities and working your way through the buyer journey gaps. But ultimately, you want to end up here, where that entire consolidated roadmap is connected to a budget ask, and then content eventually has more resources. So I will stop there. And I see there's a bunch of questions, so we can run through those. And it's a shorter presentation today, so we have more time. So feel free to add more in the group chat, and I will start to address those. So I see first question, from a product marketing standpoint, we get at looking the web pages revamp, or we're looking at getting the web pages revamped. SEO will have to be considered a priority at the start, right, and not at the end. Yes, if you're changing your website or changing web pages, definitely SEO should be a priority. The question that precedes that, though, is changing the web pages a priority in the first place, or are there other priorities when you kind of think about this model and all the other opportunities that are available to you, right? So if, for example, the biggest revenue opportunity that's available to the business is to build out its core messaging and do more of an inbound marketing approach, and maybe our paid search campaigns are not performing well because quality scores are low and we see a ton of opportunity there, then changing the website does make a ton of sense. But if it turns out that none of those things are actually opportunities and we're taking on the website work as more of a vanity exercise, then it may not be necessary to do that to begin with. But if you're down that path and you're saying you're going to change your website, then yes, you want to factor that in. I would still limit the scope unless there is a huge amount of opportunity that's being missed on the SEO side. So if we can find a way to simplify that process to quickly get to demand gen campaigns, that would be ideal. Next, I see, how do you recommend prioritizing individual content projects within the roadmap? I guess we're talking about, I might need some clarification on this, but if we're talking about standalone content projects, like let's say we're building like a specific content asset that we're not entirely sure all the different ways in which we're going to leverage it, or it's a little bit distinct from a company's strategic priorities, I would say those are fine. Every company has those where you're building certain assets that either build a brand or do other things. But I think coming back to this idea, right, at the end of the day, whatever content project you're working on fits into one of these buckets. Whether it's discovery, it's advocacy, onboarding, authority, whatever it is, it fits into one of these buckets. And you have limited resources. So no matter what, you have to trade off the time and effort that goes into creating that asset versus all the other things that you can create. And constantly being conscious of that trade-off is really important. And so when it's time to decide, are we going to produce this? Well, the question is, where else could that time go? And eventually you end up at this question anyways. So going through this exercise and saying, okay, we actually do believe that this specific individual content project is a core opportunity for us, then we trade that off and make that decision. If we're deciding to work on that content project outside of this framework, it's almost like yeah, it's interesting to work on, or it's nice to have, or I'm really passionate about this. That's good in some cases, but in a lot of cases, it puts the team in trouble because there aren't enough resources in place, and that really shows when there's, let's say, a quarterly board meeting or we're doing like a QBR, or we're looking at our annual results versus what we budgeted for our revenue forecast. Next question is, what metrics should you look at when you're auditing existing content? What makes a piece of content a good piece of content? I mean, it really depends. It's easy for an SEO asset. You just look at organic traffic and look at conversions or top of funnel pipeline that's coming from that. But a lot of assets are not like that, right? Like a nurture stream may just have the benefit of getting users through to the next stage. I think overall, it's a combination of looking at your overall funnel metrics and looking at every stage and seeing which piece of content plays a role where, and then looking at first touch for some types of assets, last touch for others, and then really triangulating the truth as you kind of bring all of those pieces of content or metrics together to say, is this actually working or not? That being said, there are some core assets where, for example, one thing that would be essential for this company, where you see an 11% MQL to opportunity rate, is we likely would want to A/B test different offerings here or different types of streams to see if one moves this from 11 to 15% and another moves it from 11 to 13%, because it's such a significant opportunity for this particular business. So A/B testing can be a good way of doing that, but you also can get caught in the cycle of optimizing something after it reaches this threshold of optimal performance. So after you get to, let's say, if you get this number to 18%, maybe it's not going to go from 18 to 25%. Maybe the maximum it goes is to like 19. So you kind of always need to check that to see if you're on the right track or if there's a better opportunity area for the business. Next question is, what team should drive the content needs/types? For example, do we need a white paper or a case study? Does campaigns team recommend a content team, or does content team need to study the campaign and recommend what types of content should be delivered for the campaign? So interesting, yeah. So I guess in this case, the campaigns team is different from the content team, and they're kind of collaborating on what needs to be prioritized and worked on together. This is a clear example of silos, right? Like if your team looks like this, where your content team is a function and your campaigns team is another function, and let's say you have a demand gen team, another function, and a creative team is another function, you have 4 functions that are a subset of the overall marketing department. And so for one function to come with certain pieces of information and the other to either send or receive directives on that is really difficult. Instead, all of this information needs to be brought to a department level and compared with the company strategy, and then determine what should be the focus. So for example, like if the campaigns team is siloed, they might say, we're targeting our Dream 100 accounts, and so we need you to produce these pieces of content. It may turn out that that's not where we should be focusing our efforts, because let's say cross-sell, upsell is a bigger opportunity for us. Where is that determination being made? It can't be made in the campaigns team because they're lacking some information there, and it can't really be made in the content team because they're producing content. So having this conversation at a department level where the key leaders are there in the room, or even at the company level to say, where should marketing focus, is critical. And then those decisions need to then emanate inside each of the sub-functions. Next question. What do you think about working with a content agency versus an in-house team? It's totally okay to work with a content agency, but specifically, and we're still on this slide, which is good, is you want the content agency to operate below the functional strategy. If you are relying on the content agency to define your functional strategy or department strategy, you're likely going to run into problems. And so what you want is, if you know that a certain area is a priority, let's say SEO, because SEO agencies are more common than others, you might have certain types of assets that are important based on where you're focused, but a content agency that's focused on SEO may have a different set of assets, and their entire filter is keyword research and difficulty and what competitors are doing. Well, if let's say we're in e-commerce software space, if every e-commerce player looks at the same data for keyword difficulty and competitors and search volumes, well, everybody's going to end up in the same place in terms of which keywords they prioritize, which is what often ends up happening, right? And so what we actually want is, we want to be different than competitors, and we have different strategies and we have different focus areas. And so that information needs to come through. And once those determinations have been made, then the agency should be executing on the roadmap. They may even bring information to you. They could say, this is the research or volumes that we found. Great, you take that as an input, then connect it to the business strategy or the department strategy, And you combine that together and give it back to them to say, these are the assets we actually want you to work on. They don't get to decide what's a priority for you because they just don't have all the information. It's rare. Every once in a while, you will find an exceptional agency that will ask you all the right questions to be able to do this work, but it's definitely more rare to have somebody that understands that. You almost need a C-level marketer to be able to do that type of work. I see next question. In the slide asking for more budget, how did you come up with the figures under the column budget ask? Was it a percentage of the overall investment required or the overall opportunity? Yeah, I mean, this is just more of an example. I'd say it depends on the situation. Let's use this as an example. I made up the number of 10 million as a revenue opportunity. It's something that we see often. Dream 100 accounts are worth at least 100,000 in general. And so now if we want to capture this, well, every Dream 100 account, if it's worth so much money to us, should have one-to-one content. So for me to put, let's say, $100,000 as an investment required here is just not realistic. Maybe that's one person. How much one-to-one content can that person really create? And so we at least need a couple, if not 3-4 people to capture this opportunity. And it needs to be a dedicated roadmap for a couple of years even to get the value out of what we see in this revenue opportunity. So that's why I put the $1 million here. And then the budget ask of 500,000, I put that as an initial ask so that we can get some initial resources, bring back metrics, prove out the model, and then ask for additional budget after that. Next question, what is the best way to estimate budget needed for prioritized initiatives so you can frame the ask when you have no historical data to base that on? Great question. So if an initiative is prioritized, you may not have historical data like this that talks about conversion rates, but you most definitely have our financial targets and you have the ability to map the revenue opportunity. So those two things are also additional data points that you can use to build the business cases. And then you can use almost either third-party resources or assumptions. And assumptions are quite underrated. Assumptions are benchmarks, or they're both quite underrated in building these right business cases to come back and say, here's where we think we should focus more of our efforts based on the fact that we have more bona fide numbers for our financial targets and the revenue opportunity that's available to us. And then the last question I see here is the bookings target linked to a specific strategic priority? Similarly, is the funnel efficiency related to gaps in the strategic priority? Great question. Again, I would say these are examples, but what we actually want is this work should be done for every strategic priority. So I could build a similar model. Let's say we're cross-selling, upselling. The numbers here would be different. On cross-sell, I'd say, okay, our customer base is, I'm just making this up, but we have 1,000 customers. Of those 1,000 customers, 300 of them fit into a cross-sell potential bucket. Out of the 300, we know that we've already sold 50 of them. Another 75 of them have said they're not interested or not in market today. So that leaves the rest for us to go target 175 or whatever's left over. Those are the people that we now need to focus on. So if we were to target each of those people, what are our conversion rates when we leverage sales, when we leverage marketing, and we try to get them into our funnel? And now I have a model for that. Similarly, you would do that with a payment processor or a Dream 100 accounts or any other campaigns that you're running. And the idea is that you want to look at all of these metrics for each one and then kind of bridge that into an overall marketing or content model to say, here's what we need overall because here are the biggest gaps. And if you think about it, you could do this not just for every lever, you could do it for every product line and the lever underneath that as well. And then when you add on geography and let's say language, if you're a much larger company, the complexity increases very quickly. And so you need a way to simplify that. And when you come to a board meeting or an executive meeting, you need to be able to explain that within a couple of slides, right? So you need a way to simplify it. So this is just one version of that, but ideally you have something a little bit more complex. I see another question. Are there any content formats, for example, white paper, super long blog post, that you think is overused and ineffective? The medium to me is less relevant. There's a ton of stuff out there about gating content versus not gating. Should we do webinars anymore? What about video versus blog posts? I mean, those things change all the time. The main thing is, are you helpful to the customer? And what is the best way to be helpful? which channel should you use, what medium should you use can vary. In some cases, you do video and a blog post. Maybe you do a long form piece of content and a podcast. Maybe it is a gated piece of content that gives you information. Maybe it's ungated. Maybe it's both, depending on the channel where you're promoting it. So I think almost thinking of it like where I like to think of it like a professional athlete. Like they have so many different things that they can tools that they can rely upon when they're making decisions in very quick sequence, but they're able to pull the right tool out of the toolbox to make those decisions. Very similarly, as a marketer, some of those items can be used almost interchangeably depending on the situation. And in some cases, they'll be more relevant. In other cases, they'll be less relevant. I see. How many people do you think are needed in the marketing team to carry out the strategy with all the steps and content that need to be created? Great question. And we did a webinar a couple of weeks ago on the ideal marketing team structure. Something like this, where you have all this stuff going on, the team better be, at least 15 people. If you're thinking about this plus standard maintenance marketing work, plus demand gen work, plus everything else you do. We have seen companies that have these kinds of strategic drivers and their marketing team is less than 10 people, often less than 7 or 5 even. And that is a recipe for disaster. And this is why the budget ask piece is so critical. If you're a content marketer and you have all of these items on your roadmap or areas that you need to focus and you're being pulled in different directions, I would argue that your biggest lever is actually not creating more content, is to do this. If you can successfully lobby for more budget, everything else will become easier. And the way to lobby for more budget is to do all this work. And then from there, the execution is almost simpler, right? We know how to do that. Like you create different assets, emails, videos, whatever. You have people that have expertise in each of those and they can do those things. But getting the budget and getting organizational buy-in and the internal education around that, or presenting to the board, or having the right data to be able to back it up, that's really where the bulk of the value is. And so evolving into a content leader that can tell the story in that way to lobby for additional budget is definitely the key. How do you measure content team capacity? That's another great question, because as we're looking at these items, you want to figure out, well, do I need 2 marketers or 10 marketers, right? And so you want to think in terms of FTEs or full-time equivalents. What you want to say is, for all the areas that we're working on, how many FTEs are required? So it might turn out that to make the payments platform a reality, to promote that properly to our base, we actually need 1.25 FTEs. So theoretically, you could ask for more than 1 product marketer, but to be conservative, you'd start with 1 to make a proof point of that. And how you estimate that is you look at what tasks or projects are involved in making that project or initiative a reality. So for something like this, it might be that we need to produce a ton of educational resources to educate the customers. We need in-product assets. We need help articles. We need email sequences. We need web pages. As I start to go down that list, it's a ton of work. And then there's ongoing sales assets that need to be updated. There's other supporting assets that are required by, let's say, customer support or success. And so as you build out those projects that are within that initiative, you try to assign some level of how many hours will this take, and then you take all those hours and you total them together and you say, we think that to make this a reality will require 2,500 hours, and that's why we think it's going to take more than 1 full-time person, and 2,500 hours over the course of a year, right, to make this a reality. And that's why we think it'll take at least 1 full-time person to work on this. At the same time, you actually want to do this for all the items that are a focus for you, and then see if some of those items actually can be either you can reallocate resources or even stop it altogether. Like, for example, maybe you did have half of one person's time going into the partner program, and as you look at this list, you're like, man, I need to put no time into this because there's so much more opportunity elsewhere. So you may reallocate that person to the payments platform instead, so you don't need to hire 1 entire person as well. So this is where the org design and the planning and the OKR planning that goes along with that, and the reallocation of resources is important, because it may even turn out you ask for whatever this is, $660,000 in additional resources here. You may only get 300, which is more than most. So let's say you get 300, now you have to make some trade-offs. Maybe instead of targeting the dream 100, you start with the dream 20 or 25, or maybe even the for top 5 accounts that you really want to target, and you prove that out, and then you go get more budget after that, right? So, but that's a really, really great question. I think that to map out all the content work against the roadmap and the OKRs is kind of how you get there, but that level of detail is essential to figuring out the right headcount. Next question, what about organizations where budgets get allocated at the campaign/demand gen level, mainly as per sales priorities for a particular product or solution, and content just follows suit to support the campaign? How do we decide on content needs in such a scenario? Some of these campaigns would be awareness, some lead gen, some plain Google and display ads. Yeah, another great question. I think, what you want to do is, if this is happening, if somebody else is deciding what is the priority for content, maybe it's your CMO, maybe it's your chief revenue officer who's deciding what's the priority for marketing, maybe it's the CEO or the board where they've identified certain things. Well, all we want to be able to do is come up or gather the intelligence from that level to understand what is a priority so that we can factor that into our plans. We, at the same time, don't want to be delegated to a support function if we have information that can change those plans. So if someone has set the strategy to, let's say, focus 100% on SEO, or let's ignore cross-sell, upsell, let's say, well, you might have information about certain email campaigns that are doing a good job. It's your job to bring that data back from the functional level back to the department level or the company level, so those decisions can be adjusted. I understand that in some organizations this is easier said than done because there are layers between hierarchy, and so passing that information up can become difficult. But that's really the answer: is you want to just not just be almost like a order taker or fulfillment function, because then you're as good as an agency. You don't have any context. You're not plugged into the overall strategy. You're just executing. And the way to kind of level up is to actually connect the work to the company strategy. So either you get in that meeting, you get access to the notes from that meeting, or you bring your own data that gets you into the meeting. Whatever you need to do to be able to show up there, to be able to contribute better. Okay, I think that's about it, guys. So thank you very much for joining. We'll be sending the recording, we'll send the slides, we'll send the additional resources that I mentioned, but appreciate the time and hope this was helpful. So thanks a lot.